Okay, good morning, everyone. Boker Tov. Good morning. Suras Tovos, hope everybody is doing well. The Rabbona Shalom works in really, really interesting ways. Just this week, I got a call from a very close friend of mine in Israel who is involved in the evangelical Christian community. And he was discussing the evangelical support for Israel during this difficult time. In general, the support of evangelicals for Israel and back and forth. So that was that was a discussion which was going on. That was Aleph. Beis, we have this morning's rally, the anti-Semitism rally, which when I said that at home, they were like, "You're going to an anti-Semitism rally?" I'm like, anti-Semitism rally, just for clarification. Exactly. So in which there are going to be members of other faith communities. That was the second Akuda. And then the letter that I wanted to share with you today from Professor Harry Wolfson actually focuses and mentions the issue of Christianity in an interesting way. I was thinking, the Rabbona Shalom is encouraging me to learn something about a topic about which I'm not very familiar. So I'm excited to share with you a few reflections from the beginning of this journey of my own learning into understanding how we can look at another faith community, what Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik calls the community of the many, as opposed to the Jewish community, which is the community of the few. Lo mirubchem mikol ha'amim, the Torah says, Kadosh Baruch Hu didn't choose us because we are the many, we are the few nonetheless. And it's a really interesting topic. There's a professor by the name of David Berger, who is probably the world's expert on this issue about Jewish-Christian relations. He's written a lot. I had a chance to read some of what he's written, but not like a scintilla, not even a schmeck of what really is out there. It's a huge topic. But I think it's interesting for us to start thinking about in how HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to relate to this phenomenon called Christianity, which probably changes from generation to generation, and our experience with them is different than those who had an experience with them over centuries in Europe. So the person, as I mentioned, who brings this to the fore in the Who is a Jew context is Harry Wolfson. Harry Wolfson's letter, which is signed Tzvi Wolfson, is written from Harvard University on the 7th of January, 1959 to David Ben-Gurion. Now, we're not going to focus on the whole letter because a lot of the elements of this letter we've talked about at different times during the year about the definition of Jew and the historical context of what that has meant in terms of halachic definitions of somebody who's Jewish. But the end of his letter, he makes a really interesting observation. So where's the context of this letter? It's being written by a man who is the first professor of Jewish studies in the history of Harvard. He was a revolutionary in creating and trailblazing the concept of academic Jewish studies in secular universities in the United States. This is a man who was a boy, not just a bacher in Slobodka. He was a boy in Slobodka. When they took him in Slobodka, he was born in 1887. When they took him in Slobodka, apparently his father or his Malamed said to the Hanhola of Slobodka, Al tistakel b'kankan ela b'mashe yeshbo. Don't look at the vessel, but what's inside. Don't think this kid is a kid. Look at what a goen he is. He was present at the last shmooze in Slobodka of Rav Yitzchak Blazer. Yeah.
What is Hebrew taught in many of these institutions, just because many of them were created and founded as religious institutions? Because I'm considering that of Chicago, I think they were teaching Hebrew before 1959, but not as part of Jewish studies.
Could be, yeah. He became a professor in 1921, I think it was, or 1925. I'm not sure when he founded the division of Jewish studies, but yeah, I think Hebrew had been, Semitic languages had probably been taught for a very long time. But his focus was philosophy. He studied a lot. He wrote a lot about Philo and others. So this is a boy who learned in Volozhin, in Slobodka, from Rav Yitzchak Blaser, who became Rav Yitzchak Petterberger before he moved to St. Petersburg to become a rabbi. He was recognized as a tremendous koach in learning, comes to America, and in 1903 attends Harvard and never leaves. He was there for over 65 years.
Did Harvard recruit him? It's not kind of America.
Yeah. So he moved to the United States in 1903. He joined Harvard in 1908. He received, I think in 1908, he received his PhD in philosophy in 1915, and then became a professor in the early 20s. He was the winner of numerous prizes and honors. He was a member of the American Academy of Jewish Research and its presidents from 35 to 37, as well as a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. In 1958, he was awarded the American Council of Scholarly Associations Prize. He wrote about Spinoza and others. He was given honorary doctorates by basically every single major Jewish university. So that was, I think, HUC, JTS, YU, Dropsy College, a few others. I mean, this was the man. And this was what he dedicated his life to. He passed away in 1974. That year, there was an article, a beautiful article that was written about him by his Talmud, Professor Isidore Twersky, right? Later to become, right, the successor as the chief of that Department of Jewish Studies in Harvard, also the Tolner Rebbe. So he writes a beautiful appreciation, which we'll quote from a little bit later, a beautiful appreciation of Harry Wolfson, which you can get online, and it's actually something you don't have to pay for. You can sign up for a free account of JSTOR, and I think it was like the American Jewish Quarterly or the Annual Jewish Yearbook, something like that. And he wrote a 10-page appreciation of Professor Wolfson, who he describes as using Bialik's terminology of the Masmid. You know that Bialik has a famous poem called Hamasmid. So Bialik's poem Hamasmid describes how he relates to and he depicts Harry Wolfson. That Harry Wolfson had a certain makom. I do not believe that he was ever married or had children. So this was his hasmada. He went to the quote unquote the Beis Medrash of the academia. He was trained. Remember, he was trained in Slobodka, and it was Yomam V'Layla, Yom V'Layla, the hasmada of Harry Wolfson. So that's the background. So he's writing this perspective of who is a Jew, and he's understanding it in a context of being in a world that really is dominated by Christianity and the faith community of the many. Think about the culture that was existing in Cambridge and the culture in America, how different it was. But even, being a peasant boy, a bacher in Slobodka, what it was like in Eastern Europe, not Pashut, not Pashut. So he knew, and he wrote about it. And he was he wrote a book about, it was called The Philosophy of the Church Fathers in 1964. He knew about this very well. He had a particular orientation, which is interesting, that Dr. Twersky quotes in the article that Professor Wolfson, he had this line, it was, bury the hatchet, not the differences. Bury the hatchet, not the differences. Stop hacking us to pieces, but also let's understand that there are differences between Jews and Christians, Jews and Catholics. So probably to all of us, right? That's an interesting context. Think of it in this light. What was his actual name? His name was Tzvi. Probably his parents called him Herschel. His name was Tzvi. He made it to America. He became Harry, of course. Harry Wolfson. What was his middle name? Anybody know? Austrian. Why was his middle name Austrian? That's a serious Bekias over here. That's why I have to come prepared. You know what I'm saying? I don't just like make this up on the spot. If I don't do research, I'm going to get eviscerated over here. Why was it? Oh, good. Yes, you saw it. That's right. He kept the name of his town. His shtetl was called Austrian. It was not far from Vilna. And he incorporated that into his middle name. They could have, right? Exactly. But that was a known thing. So obviously he wants to maintain that identity with his roots. I think in the article in the New York Times obituary, which I shared with you, I think he called himself a non-observant Jew. Right, a non-observant Orthodox Jew. An honorary doctorate. Okay. That's exactly it. And this man climbed to the heights of academia in the United States. Literally the pinnacle of the citadel. But he was still the Bacharol from Austria. So interesting, very important to think about this. So this is a man who lived in all of these worlds and who knew all of these people and encountered them. And he told us to bury the hatchet, not the differences. And that's what I want to think about today, because there are many different complex elements of a Torah or Jewish and spiritual and traditional way of thinking about our relationship with Christianity and with Christians. It's very complicated. One place to start when you have this discussion is the Rambam in the end of Hilchos Malachim. The Rambam in Hilchos Malachim U'Milchamos deals with the issue of Mashiach, Messiah. He gives you the criteria for what the Messiah is going to look like. He's going to arrive from the Davidic dynasty, and he's going to build the Beis HaMikdash, ingather the exiles. You know, this is a whole story about the Melech HaMashiach. In the last halacha, in Perek Yud Aleph, halacha Dalid, which is right before the Rambam says what the Mashiach is not going to do, which is change religion. Okay? Yes. That's the Rambam's opinion, that so this is also part of the question, because it's hard to know. It's hard to know whether we're going to know that, because are we going to establish him as the Mashiach and then he's going to build the Beis HaMikdash, or is the fact that he builds the Beis HaMikdash a siman that he is the Mashiach? Good question. Good question. The Rambam actually has a line of.
I was just wondering if it's going to be a long time period. First comes until.
Exactly. We don't. It's.
Ratio now, right? But there's a time period in between also, right?
So yeah, it's hard to know. We don't know exactly how long this is going to take. The Rambam talks about somebody who could be Bechezkas Mashiach. 1 second, let me find that line. Here it is. Just listen, in the beginning of Halacha Dal, this is interesting. It's not really our topic today, but just so you should be aware. Let's say, Im Yamun Melech mi Beis David, a king will come. Hoge b'Torah v'osik b'mitzvos kedavid Aviv. He's going to be very scrupulous about Yiddishkeit, about religion, spirituality. Like it says in the Torah Shebechsav, he will guide everyone to following the ways. He will follow the wars of Hashem. Harizeh bechezkas shu Mashiach. And then, if Im asa v'tzliach, he succeeded in leading the wars of God. V'nitzech kol ha'umos shesvivav, and he vanquished all the enemies around them. Ubana mikdash b'makomo, and he built the Beis HaMikdash. V'ki beitz nidcha Yisrael, harizeh Mashiach b'vadai. Then you know he's Mashiach. So it's not clear at what point you're going to know this person's Mashiach until he does all the things. But anyway, that's a side point. Okay. But then the Rambam says in this same halacha that there are people who HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to bring to the scene to test us. There are some people V'lo ha'mido HaKadosh Baruch Hu ela lenasos bo rabim, whom HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God is going to bring to test, which that could bring success and it could bring something else. And he quotes a pasuk in Daniel. Af Yeshua Hanotzri, who is Yeshua? That's right, Jesus. Hanotzri, the Nazarene. Shedima Sheyia Mashiach. Venerag Bebezdin. The Rambam says, according to the Rambam's version, the Rambam's story, he was killed in Bezdin, Yeshua Hanotzri. The Rambam says this person obviously was not the Mashiach. That's the Rambam's opinion, yes. He says, V'chiyesh michshol gadol mizeh. Is there any more stumbling block than this that caused more damage? At the same time, put that on one hand, at the same time, the Rambam says, nonetheless, avol machshavos borei olam ein koach ba'adam la'asigim. But we can't understand the ways of Hashem that he should bring such a person into the world. All these things of Yeshua HaNotzri, V'shel zeh HaYishmaeli. Who is this man, the Yishmaeli? What's that? That's right, Muhammad. This Ishmaelite, Muhammad. Sha'amar achrav, einon ela, the Rambam says, they are there, liyasher derech lamelech HaMashiach, to pave the way for the Mashiach. That people should be spiritually attuned to the idea of salvation and a Messiah and prophecy and all of that. Why? Because now lots of people are talking about Messiah. So you've got a complex view here that on the one hand, the arrival of Yeshu HaNotzri is a michshol. It's a terrible stumbling block. On the other hand, there is the introduction of the concept of messianism and salvation, which paves the way for the ultimate.
But all the gospels were written at least 100 years after the death of
Okay.
the people who write them, the people who lived, and Jesus never himself identified himself as a Christian.
Right. Okay.
So how can the Rambam say that he is the person who kind of changed the way? It's the people who took
In Achanami, they chose him, but that the Ribbono Shalom evidently introduced that into the world, that whole entity.
I heard at that time there were a lot of young candidates that made the finals.
That's interesting. I have to say, I was never, I don't know, probably to a fault, I was never particularly interested in this topic, and I have very little knowledge about it. When I was researching this week, there is a lot that I do not know about the origins of Christianity and Saul and Paul. We'll talk about him in a minute, but I don't know so much about this Inyan. But this is kind of giving us an introduction to the complexity of it. Here's another person who has an interesting and complex view of Christianity, and that is Rav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook. Because Rav Kook talks about and was very outspoken and wrote a lot about Christianity, but his views were also very complicated because he has different places where he writes different things. Rav Kook published Orot, which in 1920 was like a bombshell and has many different ramifications. And if you want more about that topic, take a look here. This is the newer version of Betzalel Naor's translation of Orot. This is the newest printing with the English translation. And he has like a 75-page introduction to Orot, which is amazing. Gives you the whole historical context. Rav Kook talks a lot about Orot in here. Rav Kook also wrote, and I can send you the PDF of it, he wrote something when this is 1920s, living in Israelis in Yerushalayim by this time, after First World War, chief rabbi of the land of Israel. But he also wrote about Christianity when he was in Boysk, when he was a rabbi in Europe before moving to Israel. And there was very different. And this was published in something called V'nevuchei Hador, which I can send you online. There's a whole PDF, all 254 pages of it. I mean, it's a read. I didn't get through the whole thing. I only went to skim a little bit of it. But there was an interesting article by a man by the name of Aryeh Sklar. It was written in 2015 about Rav Kook's views of Christianity. And he points out that Rav Kook, in several places in this original, what he wrote in Boysk, and especially if you go back to the original, what was called the Kvatzim, the notebooks that were uncensored, that were not published in a censored volume, many of the things that he writes there are very positive or open. There are other people who think that a person can only properly have faith in the Moses true Torah, so as long, this is the Sklar translation, so as long as one also believes that all other faiths are false and foolish, and there is nothing positive in holding fast to them. But that is not true. Can I trouble you just for that door, please? I'm so sorry to be mishtamish on them chashuv. We have the rally soon, so I'm sure they're going to be banging around. He said, however, there are ideas that the Jewish nation are accustomed to, which cause much of the masses to think this view, but this is not true. This view is indeed useful in that it sometimes strengthens Jewish faith, etc., but there is also much evil that comes from this view if it's not corrected. For the contempt that is imprinted deep in the heart of the masses for other faiths also causes people to be secular, wicked people who also consider pure Jewish faith the same in this regard. They say both ways are equal. This is faith and that is faith. Rav Kook says there are some benefits to appreciating elements of Christianity, not the fundamental tenets which go against Judaism, but maybe things that they're built on that can be viewed as beneficial. So this is early in, I think, 1906.
Still 150 years after the Constitution.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. So he talks about morality, which is an idea that the Meiri talks about. That's one aspect of Rav Kook's writings. But if you look later in Orot, where Rav Kook is much more strident in his criticism, and it's much more along the Rambam's understanding of it's a michshol, and it's breaking, and it's problematic. And he refers to it, this is using the Na'or translation, there is a certain type of spiritual poison whose nature it is to rub out the special Jewish content. It's referred to as a poison, which it's to rub out, it's to erase. And how, in this regard, the poison draws sustenance from the moist flow of the spirit and the ethics. It spreads over a multitude of nations very well. But it munches as an ox, totally destroying, desiring to swallow the interior life of life, thirsting to erase the name Israel from the face of the earth, to destroy the inner splendor of the world instead of an outer coarse content. He's talking about Christianity's assault on Judaism and swallowing up the world with its popularity and its worldview. So very complicated. You know, Rav Kook is of the idea that the Ribono Shel Olam guides history, and all things that happen, which it's difficult in most circumstances and impossible in others, when you think about cataclysmic events like the Holocaust, to understand how that somehow is bringing an ultimate tikkun. But Rav Kook understands that we are in a talich throughout history. He writes this in Orot. He describes that there is this movement, and it's actually similar to something that appears in the Ramchal, that there is this unfettered, unceasing movement toward tikkun, toward shleimus. And perhaps somehow HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought Christianity into the world as a stumbling block, as a barrier, as a diversion of this. And on the one hand, the Rambam is telling us that there is something that is revealed through this. On the other hand, it's a stumbling block. So here too, we have this very complicated relationship. So how do we approach it? So Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, Zecher Tzaddik Livracha, in 1964, delivered a talk at the Midwinter Conference of the RCA. This came about in the context of major debates regarding ecumenical dialogue. And he delivered this paper, was called Confrontation. And you can get it online on Tradition. I have it printed here. I can send it to you. It's available. It's fascinating. It's incredible. And the Rav sets down 4 principles by which we can engage in dialogue with the faith community of the many, with Christianity. He says the first is, we must state in unequivocal terms, we are a totally independent faith community. We are not Jews relevant to, in relationship with, in the context of any other religion. Yes, from a cultural standpoint, there are notions that Jews and Judaic values have in common with Christianity, but those are cultural, not spiritual. The first part, I'm skipping to the second half of Confrontation. We could probably spend like 6 months just on Confrontation. But the first part, he talks about how Jews are Jews and human beings. As human beings, we have an acharayus to cure cancer, solve hunger, end poverty. You know, the universal milu es haaretz v'chiv shua. But when it comes to a spiritual identity, we are distinct. We are separate. So the Rav says the first issue is that if we are to engage in dialogue with another faith community, we have to establish, number one, that we're not a faith community relating to anybody else. We are an independent faith community. That's number one. Number two, the logos, the language which religious experience is used to express itself is unique to every faith community. And therefore, it is incomprehensible to another faith community. And so the religious or theological logos cannot be used between Jews and Christians because we have totally different faith experiences. To recognize those differences is to respect the fact that their language, their spiritual language is one, and our spiritual language is a totally different. That's number two, the logos. Number three, he says, we, members of the community of the few, should always act with tact and understanding and refrain from suggesting to the community of the many, which is both proud and prudent, changes in its rituals or emendations of its texts. Don't go around giving them mussar as what they should or they should not, they this or they that. That's their religion. Leave them alone. We shouldn't make suggestions to them. So we have to figure out how would he feel about that? And there was an entire symposium, it's all referenced in a minute, about this article. Fourth, this is the last and also very personal, because you imagine, Harry Wolfson and Rav Soloveitchik, they came from experiences where anti-Semitism was not a concept, where Christian hatred was not a text, it was a living experience. Fourth, the Rav was born in 1903 in Kruzan, in Poland. Fourth, we certainly have not been, this is very powerful, we certainly have not been authorized by our history, sanctified by the martyrdom of millions, to even hint to another faith community that we are mentally ready to revive historical attitudes, to trade favors pertaining to fundamental matters of faith, and to reconcile, quote unquote, some difference. Such a suggestion would be nothing but a betrayal of our great tradition and heritage and would furthermore produce no practical benefits. We are not changing our views. We are not compromising. We're not agreeing with. We're just going to be in conversation with. Only a candid, frank, and unequivocal policy reflecting unconditional commitment to our God, a sense of dignity, pride, and inner joy in being what we are, believing with great passion in the ultimate truthfulness of our views, praying fervently for and expecting confidently in the fulfillment of our eschatological vision when our faith will rise from particularity to universality, will impress the peers of the other faith community among whom we have both adversaries and friends. Yes?
All four of those, in some sense, to me, are variations on the idea that each thinks the other is somehow complete. And that there's, if only this, we tweak here or we tweak there, there would be this combining of the two.
So David Berger has an essay where he talks about, from a Christian standpoint, there's this essay was written, I think, in 2010, based on the writings of Cardinal Ratzinger, who later became the Pope, right? Now he's the Friedricher Pope, even though he's still living. He's retired. I don't know how that works exactly. Emeritus, Pope Emeritus. So he points out that in some of the doctrines, what he's writing about, it's about their vision that Jews will ultimately come to believe in their Savior. And we can't accept that. But the Rav is saying is that we don't need to tell them what to think or what to believe. They're entitled to think whatever they want. And David Berger points out the same thing. We shouldn't go around thinking that they have to conform to what we think they should think, because we don't want them to insist on us that we should conform to what they think. Exactly. Exactly. And this brings us to thinking about the context in which we are right now. We can fight anti-Semitism on a human level, on a universal level, on a cultural level. It has nothing to do with religion. We could support Israel having nothing to do with theological arguments. Yes, people who are much more knowledgeable than I will tell you that, more about the different, the different Stieblach, there's Protestantism, and then there's this Chassidus, and there's that division, there's that, I don't know all these things. But what the Rav is saying is that we have to maintain our personal identity, and we can have a conversation, not using religious language, using social language, that it's wrong to have a terrorist group shoot 4,000 missiles at innocent people. And that we should stand up for ourselves with anybody in the world who's willing to stand up and say that this is wrong. So what's interesting, there are a lot of interesting things here. What's also super, super interesting to me is that Rabbi Sachs comments on this article of confrontation. But before we get to Rabbi Sachs, I'm going to come back to Harry Wolfson for a second, because everything that we've said until now is that there is a complex relationship between Judaism and Christianity. There are elements which seem to be a significant mikshol, a destructive element, but then there are aspects that, according to the Rambam, bring the messianic idea into the world. On the other hand, as the Rav said, we must be very strong in maintaining our identity. So Harry Wolfson writes in his letter, we have to be careful. If the state of Israel starts defining Jews not according to a religious halachic definition, what's going to be the consequence of that in the greater narrative? And this is what I thought was unique about this letter, which I wanted to share with you. This letter references Christianity. He says, you have to be careful. You have to be careful. Yesh lachshosh, you have to be concerned. Shema, maybe. Yiru, people will see. Ba'achlata al hanchayos harishum, ma'asen no'ez mitzad memshelas Yisrael. This no'ez means like sharp decision on behalf of the government of Israel to decide baharamas etzba, by raising a finger, she'ila achas, one question that is burning, bo'eres, that was a major selah hamachlokas, the point of contention for elef ke'alpayim shana, almost 2,000 years between us and the Notzri. And over 100 years between us, meaning between Reform and traditional Jews, about the role of observance. Everybody knows, he says, we all know the hevdel, the difference, sha'asa, that he made, misha kara la'atzmo shliach lagoyim, who called himself the emissary to the nations? Saul of Tarshish, also known as Paul. Between Yisrael lafi habasar, Israel of the flesh, and Israel of the God. That the Jews, we are Israel of the flesh, but we're not Israel of the God. And he says, you also know what happened with Reform rabbis who said you can give up all of these actions, all of these practices, religious practices. He says, ilazos, it's not proper, it's improper that the state of Israel should give pischon peh, should give an opening to speak for those who see themselves as Israel of the Lord. Who's he referring to? Who sees themselves as Israel of the Lord? Christians. Sheyachrizu b'kol, that they should stay sof nitzchum shol hatarsi, that Saul of Tarsus was right. Ve'im in aroy gamkein. It's not proper also shemem shelas Yisrael, the state of Israel, tachrotz mishpat, should stay a sentence, b'dvar ha'alul, that may cause litain Paul makom litos, to give Paul the opening to say shu misarev, that he's getting involved in a machlokas, that we don't need Jewish observance anymore. That once Osoish, that man came along, all you need is to belong to the community, the Israel of God. You don't need Israel of the flesh. That's been superseded. To say that people can be Jews without Judaism, he says, we've been down that road before. A new angle to the question of who is a Jew. We've been at this now since October. It's now the end of May, but it's a new angle. To take Judaism out of Jew, that's essentially, he says, that's Christianity. Just believe in God, that's all, just announce it. Oh. So now this comes back. So the question is, how does this relate to us? Most of us are not involved in ecumenical dialogue. We're not running who is a Jew. So here we come to two ha'aros. One from Rabbi Sachs, Zecher Tzaddik Livracha, and the other one from Professor Wolfson. Rabbi Sachs, in a beautiful article reflecting on confrontation, called The Voice of Judaism in the Conversation of Mankind, Rabbi Sachs, of course, describes how he views himself as a spokesman of Judaism to the world. He says, a significant portion of my work is involved with other faiths. I cherish the relationships I have made. Successive archbishops of Canterbury and cardinal archbishops of Westminster have become close personal friends. And he describes how he communicates Judaism on the BBC and the national press. He says, it may come as a surprise that I believe Rav Soloveitchik was right in his essay Confrontation. And I have taken it as my guide throughout. That's what he says. This beacon to the outside world is rooted in Rav Soloveitchik's article. He says it's important to understand that there is distinction. He uses the word incommensurable rather than incommunicable. He says that's what he prefers. It will be familiar to the readers of the late Sir Isaiah Berlin. Each is distinct. There are at the same time things that are profoundly held in common. They are in no small measure constitutive of the human situation. We're all vulnerable. We all need protection. Human life in particular is sacrosanct. Each person is unique, therefore irreplaceable, therefore deserving of safety and indeed dignity. Our interests and desires conflict, therefore we need justice and the rule of law. So Rabbi Sachs says, and there's a lot more to say about this, he says that we can still find ways, number one, to have common human interests in taking care of Lasakin Olam, to fix the world. That's my term, not his here. He talks about a distinction, not exactly the same as the Rav, but very similar. The difference between Bein Adam LaChavero and Bein Adam LaMakom, joining together to ameliorate the human condition, is this Bein Adam LaChavero. It's a meta principle. And the concept of Darkei Shalom, of being at peace. And so Rabbi Sachs says that is precisely what I try to do when I share Judaic reflections with the wider society. I make it clear that these are Jewish thoughts, not binding on anyone who stands outside our tradition, but that they may find that they strike a resonant chord. Surprisingly often, they do. What I tried to show in my book, says Rabbi Sachs, The Dignity of Difference, is that there is a delicate balance to be struck between our commonalities and our differences. Put simply, if we had nothing in common, we could not communicate. If we had everything common, there would be nothing to say. So we have something to bring to the world, which is distinctly ours, that can illuminate and it can enhance. And he concludes here with a story from an email that he got from a total stranger, a Christian in San Jose, California, after September 11th. And how Rabbi Sachs's work brought this person closer to their faith. Should I, a Jew, give thanks for helping a Christian woman rediscover her faith? Should a Christian thank God for the opportunity of making a Jew better, a more believing Jew? Those are questions I long ago decided to leave to the world to come. In the meanwhile, God has given us much to do, not the least to learn to live graciously and generously together in a world that grows smaller every year. So this is number one, Rabbi Sachs' perspective. And number two is a piece from Professor Wolfson, which I think is so important. Handling Christians and Jews, us and them, and what we can dialogue, what we shouldn't dialogue, getting hung up on all these different issues. That's not the main Indian. Today, says Professor Wolfson, the problem which Judaism has to contend with is indifference. You know, when Rav Kook was dealing with Christianity, it was a huge issue. It was an existential issue. It was a theological issue. It was right in your face. Today, and now Professor Wolfson is writing years ago, this is published in 1918, around the same time as Rav Kook. But he's talking, I think, to our generation. How many of us face the issue of Christianity as an ongoing threat? In a different piece, Professor Wolfson talks about how historically Christianity was on the defensive and they kept trying to convince us to come to their side. Now, more Jews have taken the burden of proof because we've been so acculturated among Christians that we have to inspire ourselves and not get sucked into them. That's an interesting ha'ara. This point in this paragraph is a little different. Once it was error. To fight error, meaning Christianity, be that error superstition or heresy, so with kfira or whatever Judaism considered the error, that implies a certain courage and conviction. Once Judaism had both, it knew its own mind and spoke it. Judaism stood defined in terms clear and unmistakable, in a cumulative written tradition. Not that the living tradition, the life and the institutions of the people has ever been discounted as a source from which an understanding of Judaism could be derived, but the living tradition was significant only as far as it had been continuous pure and adulterated, guided and controlled by eternal, immutable principle. Judaism was then something objectively real and tangible, from which it was conceived possible that the entire Jewish people could be led astray, etc. The nomistic character of Judaism, whatever else it may have meant, surely meant that Judaism was not a mere will-o'-the-wisp. Today, he's writing this in 1918. Think about what it means in 2021, how much we need to be mechazik each other. Today, a perverted sense of democracy and of a biological nationalism have given rise to a doctrine of the religion of the people corresponding to the old autocratic doctrine of their religion of their king, of the king. Judaism is now the changing mood of the Jews. It is no longer inheritance. It is a set of inherited characteristics. It is no longer a discipline. It is a daydream. We cannot take Jewish life of today as the source of Judaism, for we are all now in a state of apostasy, both in a religious and in a secular cultural sense. To remain as Jews, it is not sufficient for us to continue to be what we are, for we are not what we should be. Jewish life of today is indeed peculiar, but it is not peculiarly Jewish. He's looking at a world of assimilation in 1918. Imagine what he would say, Rahman al-Islam, in 2021, where so many Jews don't even recognize that they're Jewish. So this man, Tzvi, from Austrian, what?
But he himself, he stopped, but he himself didn't see.
That's true. Okay, this is part of the struggle. And part of what he's probably writing is autobiographical, right? His own internal struggle. But I think that's what we have to decide. Instead of worrying about, what is our theological position, which maybe is the role for some, but for the average everyday person, we've got to figure out, is our Yiddishkeit on fire? Are we inspired? What does our Judaism look like? And the truth is that in that sense, it's actually helpful to think about our relationship with Christianity, because it requires that we look in the mirror and say, well, what does it even mean to be Jewish? Why are we having this discussion at all? Do we even care? The problem which Judaism has to contend with is indifference. That line that he writes resonates more now than ever before. We have to make sure that our Yiddishkeit is not indifferent. It's the same hislavos, the same passion with which Rav Kook struggled with and wrote about the Jewish relationship with Christianity, that bothered him, that moved him, that he thought about, that he wrestled with. That's the same thing. That's the same way that we should think about it for ourselves. The same conviction, and it comes through in the words of Rav Soloveitchik, the way that he felt of the tradition of Judaism. Do we have that feeling of conviction? And the same majesty and the same confidence that Rabbi Sachs conveyed Judaism to the world from his incredible pulpit, can we muster that confidence and that pride and that conviction in ourselves? That, I think, is the takeaway from thinking about the Jewish and Christian dialogue brought to our attention in these few lines by the famed, great, late Tzvi Wolfson.